I made a mallet. So this is a pretty traditional joiner's mallet. The design came from some measurements that Chris Schwarz took from a mallet made by Roy Underhill. And then I made it using some techniques from a video by Paul Sellers. So I've got links to all that stuff down below. This particular mallet, the head is made from live oak, which is a very tough wood, and I'll get into a lot of the things I learned from working on this particular species of wood. And then the handle is made of ash. Both of these, the ash I actually got from a tree in my yard, and the live oak came from a log that a friend of mine gave me that came out of their yard. So it's very local stuff. It was a lot of fun to make, and I love the mallet. I didn't take a lot of video while I was making this because frankly I had no idea what I was doing for a lot of it. I actually split apart a log and planed out the wood and did all that stuff, things that I had never done before. And I've never worked with live oak before, which was really an experience. So I'll get into that here shortly. Alright, so as I mentioned before, I started this project off with some logs. So on the left there, the large log is the live oak log that someone gave me. In the middle here are a couple of chunks of ash that I got from a tree in my yard. And I've never really split a log before. So I practiced on the ash, figuring that would be easier, and it was. And it actually wasn't too hard. So I got a wedge and a sledgehammer and split it into several sections. No problem. So then I decided to start in on the live oak log. So I started by trying to square it up. So I split the sides off as best I could. They didn't really split as straight as the ash did. But between splitting off the outside sections and using my axe to cut off some of the bark, I got it down to something pretty usable. And then next I cut the live oak log to length, to the size I needed. It was still much too large, but at least it was the right length. And I did that with a handsaw, and that was my first clue that this was probably going to be hard. It took me a long time to saw through this thing. It's probably, I don't know, probably an 8-inch log, maybe, something like that, 8 to 10 inches. So it took me quite a while to cut through that. Now what I didn't show here, I didn't get any pictures of it unfortunately, is I then tried to split it further, and that I eventually did get it to split. I split it right down the middle, and that gave me just enough usable space for the mallet head. And it took a lot of effort with the wedge. I was banging on that thing with the sledgehammer for probably 30 minutes before I actually got it to split. It did not want to split. It took a long, so live oak is tough stuff. And then next I started sawing it down, and I quickly decided I did not want to use a handsaw to rip this down. So I broke down and used my table saw. So I started taking sections off the side until I got to a completely flat side with minimal checks in it. So you can kind of see in this picture that you can see the burn marks from the table saw. I don't know how many passes it took, but my table saw is not super powerful. And so I would have to take probably like a 1/4 inch at a time. So and then raise the blade another 1/4 inch, do another pass, raise it another 1/4 inch, do a pass. And so I eventually got through the section of log, but it took a lot of time and left a lot of scorching because I was cutting through it so slowly. So by the end of this, I had it mostly cut down to rough size, and I also used the table saw to kind of rough cut the slightly angled cuts on each end, so it was the correct length and width at this point. But next up, I needed to take off those burn marks. So I sharpened up my plane, and it turned out that a sharp plane actually did pretty well on live oak, as tough as it is. So I got it down to looking something like this, which is about the finished, about the final finish on it. Now I planed, and the problem with live oak is the grain changes direction a lot. It's very wavy, and I think it kind of is interlocked to some degree. And what that means is that when you plane it, there's a lot of tear out, so the surface it leaves is not very smooth. So I basically came back in here with a hand scraper and took it down and got it very smooth with a hand scraper. I love hand scrapers. They're a lot of work to use, but especially with tough grain that you're having trouble planing, it's just wonderful. So I don't really have any pictures of the hand scraper, but that's what I used to get the final finish. I ended up not using any sandpaper on this, and I got a very smooth finish on the wood with the hand scraper. So next up, I started roughing out the handle. So I used a piece of ash for this, as I mentioned, and after working with the live oak, this was super easy to work with. I really like planing ash. I didn't listen to the common advice, which is to use very, very straight grain for the handle. It has fairly straight grain, but it had a few knots in it, so the grain changes direction a little bit in there, which made it a little tricky to plane, but not too bad. And I did eventually come back in with a hand scraper, but honestly, the smoothing plane got it almost to the final finish on the handle. So next up, I returned to working on the mallet head, and so the next step was doing the making the mortise straight through the center of the head. So it's kind of an interesting mortise. It sort of tapers, so that as you're swinging the mallet, the head can't really come off of the handle, because the handle and the mallet head are tapered in such a way that it just won't, it kind of wedges itself in further, and it will not come off, which is really, really great. So I had to cut that mortise. So I started with my brace and bit, and before I got through one rotation with that brace, I realized there was no way I was going to be able to drill this hole with that. So I pulled out my power drill again, and I had to rely on power drills a lot when dealing with this live oak. It was just so hard. And I drilled the hole out with a Forstner bit. And then I spent quite a bit of time with it with a mortising chisel. And so this is the I believe that's the final mortise there in the picture, and that's the top. So that's the wider end of the mortise. It's slightly narrower at the bottom. So I had, again, difficulty with my mortising chisel. I used it for a while, and then I actually kind of ruined the edge of the chisel, and it was in pretty bad shape. It almost like bent over the edge of the chisel, and so I had to end up regrinding the chisel to get past this damaged edge that the live oak had caused. And so that's where I learned to sharpen my chisels even better. I learned some new skills there. So from then on, so that I wouldn't have to keep regrinding the edge, I learned to use a leather strop and honing compound to get the chisel really, really sharp. And basically, as I was cutting the mortise, every probably 10 minutes or so, I would stop and restrop the edge, and that kept a nice sharp edge on the mortising chisel, and it also protected it from getting damaged like it had before. So can't say enough good things about keeping a sharp edge on your chisel, and it just, the working with the live oak made that very clear how important that is to keep a sharp edge. So yeah, the live oak does a number on your edge tools, so definitely keep resharpening them frequently if you're working with live oak. So next up, I had to fit the handle to this mortise that I had just created, and the handle was rough shaped. It was probably about an 1/8 inch too wide in each dimension. So I planed it down and basically just kept planing down, and I wanted to have a nice wedge on the far end, a wedge shape on the far end, but the handle needed to pass all the way through the mortise. So basically I would thin down the handle at one end until it fit into the mortise, and then I would kind of see where it stopped on the handle, and that told me where I needed to plane next. And so it probably took me, I don't know, an hour or so of planing and just trying the handle in the mortise and pulling it back out, planing a little more, try it again. And eventually I got down until the handle seated fully in the mallet head. And I think you can see in this next picture here, the far end of the handle is sort of wedge shaped. It's a very subtle shape, but that was basically arrived at just by guessing and testing, just planing a bit, putting it back in the mortise, planing a little bit more, putting it back in the mortise, and eventually it sort of naturally evolved into this nice wedge shaped end. And I'm really happy with how it kind of fits in the mortise and how it feels in my hand, and it's really really a nice fit, I think. I'm very happy with it. So lastly, before finishing, there were a couple of checks, especially on one side of the mallet head, and I don't think they would have hurt the mallet head structurally, but I kind of wanted to fill them in and stabilize those checks just in case. So I filled those in with epoxy, and there was even one knot on the handle that I also wanted to kind of stabilize, so I put a little epoxy in that knot as well. And then I used my scraper again to take off the excess epoxy on the outside. And then the last picture here is just of the finished mallet. And so I did finish it a little bit. I put boiled linseed oil on both the handle and on the mallet head, and then when that was dry, and I just put one coat of boiled linseed oil, and when that was dry, I gave it about 24 hours to cure. Then I came back and put paste wax on the outside to give it a nice kind of luster, and it feels really nice in the hand, that paste wax surface. So there you have it. That's how I made my mallet. I love this thing. It is great for doing joinery. It's heavy, it's solid. I love it. Thanks for watching.